For Chuck Norris and his wife, the nightmare began when Gina had 3 MRIs in 1 week to evaluate her rheumatoid arthritis and ended up in the ER.
I would go in and they'd say, well, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't feel good. And I'm burning.
Doctors didn't consider that Gina might have been poisoned by gadolinium, the toxic heavy metal in a dye injected into her for the MRIs. Todd Wahlberg is the Norris's attorney.
There's internal documents that go back decades that show that the companies knew about the risks of gadolinium.
Heather Townsend wanted to trace her roots, so she submitted a sample through a popular at-home genetic testing company.
I always knew, like, I'm Scottish, I'm English, I'm Polish, all these things, and so I was kind of expecting it to be reaffirmed. It's just kind of a fun thing.
That's only part of the business plan. The other part of the business plan is to sell that information to some other companies who are interested in your DNA.
We owe too much money to foreigners, and we're getting close to the point where we're as in debt to foreigners relative to the size of our wealth in the economy as the Greeks, the Spaniards, or the Irish were when their economies failed.
Hello, I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Welcome to Full Measure. 3 decades of scientific thought regarding the safety of dye commonly used in MRIs has been upended, but odds are you haven't heard much about it. Today we begin with an important follow-up to a story we first brought you last year. We told the distressing case of Chuck Norris and his wife Gina, who became critically ill after her MRIs. After our original report aired, health bodies in the U.S. and many other countries made major changes. So why don't you know more about them? Chuck Norris and his wife Gina are now suing McKesson Corporation and other companies related to gadolinium MRI dye. Dozens of gadolinium poisoning claims have been filed nationwide.
I want to try this case in the public because they would love for it to remain in the shadows and not be talked about.
Windy today, but it's beautiful.
We first told you their story last June. Their nightmare began when Gina had 3 MRIs in 1 week to evaluate her rheumatoid arthritis and ended up in the ER over and over.
By the 4th, 5th, 6th night, the burning just kept traveling, and I would go in and they'd say, well, what's wrong with you? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't feel good. And I'm burning. That's all I can tell you is I'm burning all over. I feel like I have acid everywhere in my tissues. I'm on fire.
Doctors didn't consider that Gina might have been poisoned by gadolinium, the toxic heavy metal in a dye injected into her for the MRIs. After researching scientific literature and connecting to patients online, Gina told her husband she knew what was wrong.
When we got to the hospital in Houston, I said, I'm only going to be able to tell you this one time, and I need you to listen to me very closely. I have been poisoned with gadolinium, or by gadolinium, and we don't have much time to figure out how to get this out of my body or I am going to die.
I can take her anywhere in the world. I'm blessed enough to have the money to do that. But where do I take her?
They only found help with alternative medicine doctors who discovered Gina's gadolinium levels were literally off the charts. Healing has taken several years and $2 million of treatments not covered by insurance.
But it's worth it.
We caught up with the Norrises again at their Texas ranch, where Gina is still in intensive treatment.
Like I've said before, we're all broken. We are broken. If I were to stop any of those things with gadolinium deposition disease, it's lurking in my body and it talks to me. If I am exposed to things or under too much stress, I can feel very, very symptomatic, but I'm still healing.
If you had to explain in just a paragraph or so what this lawsuit is about, what would you say?
This lawsuit is about a big cover-up by the drug companies that has resulted in a whole population of people who have been poisoned by gadolinium. There's internal documents that go back decades that show that the companies knew about the risks of gadolinium.
Todd Wahlberg is the Norris's attorney. He attended an FDA safety meeting that was scheduled shortly after our story aired, one advocates had pressed for years. Gina's case was brought up.
The disconnect noted in Gina Norris's statement is so true all across this country every single day.
At the conclusion of that September hearing, there was a vote held, and the FDA committee voted 13-1 in favor of requiring additional warnings.
The only no vote came from one FDA advisor who said the recommended warnings weren't strong enough.
When a patient finally does get tested and is found to have gadolinium retention, but there is no FDA-approved antidote, what does that patient do?
There's been a dramatic evolution in thought since MRI dye was introduced 30 years ago. Doctors and the FDA used to insist gadolinium was quickly urinated out of the body. But in 2006, internal FDA documents show scientists recognized gadolinium was linked to a deadly disease that causes thickening and tightening of the skin and organs, nephrogenic systemic fibrosis, or NSF. In 2007, the FDA added a serious black box warning, but only for patients with weak kidneys. In 2010, an expanded warning about repeat MRIs. Then in 2015, the FDA also acknowledged there could be risks to people with normal kidneys.
Recent studies conducted in people and animals have confirmed that gadolinium can remain in the brain, even in individuals with normal kidney function. Available information does not identify any adverse health effects.
By then, injured patients like Sharon Williams were networking online. She had 5 MRIs with gadolinium over several years and got sicker each time.
So my symptoms got dramatically worse after dose 4. We thought there had to be something wrong with my brain, so I had dose 5 for a brain MRI, and literally all hell broke loose after that. I mean, it was terrible.
Meaning what?
Meaning that's when all the symptoms went crazy. I mean, I couldn't begin to tell you how severe some of the symptoms were as far as pain, spasms, problems with my blood pressure.
How did you figure out it was this gadolinium?
In 2014, I had part of the thyroid gland removed and gadolinium was in it, 51 months after my last MRI.
Williams contacted the FDA regularly starting in 2012, presenting scientific research and asking for help, only to be told the matter was under study. It's taken years for major health bodies to acknowledge major issues. In May of last year, the FDA stepped up warnings again, saying gadolinium is not only retained in the brain, but in body organs too, but it downplayed any risks. Shortly after, Europe and Japan banned most uses and types of the most problematic gadolinium dyes. The FDA decided on a different approach last December, deciding not to issue a ban in the U.S., insisting gadolinium benefits outweigh any risks. Instead, the FDA ordered new safety studies. According to the FDA, the bigger problem occurs with the types of dyes called linear, which stay in the body longer and in larger amounts. The FDA says there's more risk with Omniscan or Optimark than Eovist, Magnavist, or Multihance. The lowest levels remain in the body after Dotarim, Gatavist, and Prohance, according to the FDA. You might think all of this would make national headlines since MRIs are so common. There are 30 million MRIs in the U.S. each year. But we had to hunt pretty hard to find the latest safety information on the FDA website. It wasn't on the main MRI page. When we clicked over to MRI safety, it wasn't there either. And it didn't show up when we searched MRI dye safety or MRI dye. We finally found it when we searched gadolinium safety. Gadolinium manufacturers say they're following all FDA recommendations. Some are phasing out so-called linear gadolinium dyes. The makers firmly deny any cover-up and say they've taken action and followed FDA rules as soon as they've learned of any safety concerns. The Norrises say the FDA hasn't done enough.
Well, they made some acknowledgement. They've moved the needle a little bit, but they haven't moved it enough.
Some people think because your name is on this cause, that's what's helped it get attention, and maybe that's what even helped spur the FDA action after so many years.
I really don't think so. I think it's her, because she had a good way of explaining what is going on. I am just her companion. I am trying to keep her healthy. And that's what I've been doing, for several years now.
5 years.
But the thousands of others that can't afford this, this is what bothers me, is seeing, I'm so great for my wife, but I want to see these people being taken care of too.
I don't need this stress, but it's become so personal to the victims that have, either died or that are suffering in silence and that don't have a voice. Thankfully, we have a platform, and as far as I'm concerned, I'll be their worst nightmare until they do the right thing. I'm not going away. I'm not going away.
McKesson told us that since it distributes but doesn't manufacture gadolinium, it's never been involved in the FDA approval process. Ahead on Full Measure, mail-order genetic tests promise to reveal your ancestry, but wait until you hear what else you're giving away when you share your DNA. Earlier this year, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg faced questions about privacy and how his company uses the information you share. The same questions could be asked about those popular home DNA test kits and what the companies behind them do with your genetic information. Our Lisa Fletcher investigates the promise and profits of DNA.
I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt.
Unlocking who you really are.
I'm everything. I'm from all nations.
Is the promise of at-home DNA testing.
The surprise was Scandinavian, actually.
Heather Townsend wanted to trace her roots, so she submitted a sample to the company MyHeritage.
I always knew, I'm Scottish, I'm English, I'm Polish, all these things, and so I was kind of expecting it to be reaffirmed. It's just kind of a fun thing.
Sheldon Krimsky heads the Council for Responsible Genetics, a public interest watchdog group focusing on genetic technologies. He wrote a consumer guide about DNA tests and suggests the results may not be worth the risk.
People can use your DNA in ways that you may not like.
So, instead of focusing so much on tracing Heather's lineage of Scottish, English, and Scandinavian ancestry, let's trace some of the concerns about DNA testing. 1. Selling your chromosomes for cash.
So the objective here isn't just to sell DNA kits for fun?
That's only part of the business plan. The other part of the business plan is to sell that information to some other companies.
Back in 2013, a 23andMe board member said in an interview with Fast Company, the long game here is not to make money selling kits. Once you have the data, the company does actually become the Google of personalized healthcare. The big buyer of your DNA data? Researchers.
Somebody comes over to you and says, I want to use your DNA for research. And you might say, what kind of research? Oh, I don't know. I want to do research on building biological weapons. Oh, no, not my DNA. Forget it. I'm not interested in that. But in this case, you may not have a choice because they're not going to ask you.
23andMe allows users to opt in to research as it hopes to begin drug development. But if you opt in and your DNA is the key to a breakthrough, you'll never know.
If you have a very unusual genotype, very unusual, that's so valuable to a company, they'll make money on it. You won't see a penny.
The next concern? Privacy.
Your privacy is not so well protected. It may be that somebody gets your DNA and it's anonymized, but there's so many ways of de-anonymizing your DNA that eventually somebody can find out who that DNA belongs to.
As science surges forward, the law lags behind. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act was signed in 2008. It says your healthcare provider and your employer cannot seek out your DNA to make a decision about your care or your job. But if you make it available, that changes the game.
If you put it on your social media sites, that's up for grabs, then they can use it.
Are people a bit naive in posting that information?
Yes, absolutely. If you post information that you have a certain mutation, for example, and your healthcare provider sees that information, they can use it.
The at-home DNA testing kit is ever expanding. The FDA has approved marketing of at-home testing kits for risks for serious diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and most recently, cancer. The more tests, the more reasons to swab and send. The larger the DNA database grows. Now, let's chart who is responsible for protecting you. You are your own watchdog. Senator Chuck Schumer led calls for transparency by the DNA testing industry and for protection of your data.
That's because DNA testing firms don't clearly disclose to consumers exactly what they're doing with the DNA once a person's cheek swab is sent in to the company.
Last December, the Federal Trade Commission made note of the issue, posting this article urging the consumer to consider the privacy implications. That means you're on your own.
I kind of get numb to like, oh, check the box and read the fine print, but I don't really read the fine print. As you know, it's kind of like I'm used to all these electronic things, and it's like, here's your rights, check the box.
Check our site. We're going to change our privacy policies from time to time, so keep checking our site. Well, that's hardly how many people are going to do that.
In the next 4 years, at-home genetic tests are expected to be a $340 million a year industry. That's only the kit sales. The real cash cow is that DNA database. By some estimates, the potential gene market will be worth as much as $100 billion by 2030. Townsend says she'd do it all again, but through a very different lens.
Things should be more explicit in the disclaimer. So I feel like they can say, you know, your data can be out there. That might scare people, though. So I think that's probably why they don't do it.
What makes our genes so possibly valuable to them?
Well, scientists can comb through your genetic material looking for things like resistance to HIV or cancer, and then that could be turned into some sort of a treatment or vaccine worth billions, and you would never be the wiser.
Never be paid.
No, but I should mention, Ancestry.com and 23andMe said that all of their users have the power to opt out of research, and MyHeritage DNA, the company that Heather used, says it does not sell any information. You can read all of the company's statements on our website.
Very good. Thanks. Coming up on Full Measure, America is borrowing more than it can pay back. One economist says we should all be concerned about national debt. In today's Follow the Money, as a nation, we now owe $21 trillion. And since the country spends more than it takes in, the debt keeps growing. Economist Peter Morici says our political leaders are taking big risks and haven't learned much from past mistakes made in the 2008 fiscal crisis. Under both the Bush and Obama administrations, it was said the banks were too big to fail, which I take to mean that regardless of any misbehavior they did, we would have to bail them out and make sure they survived.
We had very large financial entities failing, and they couldn't be merged into other entities very easily, and with that, the system came apart. Could it happen again? Absolutely. The big banks are even bigger than they used to be.
You've said if the fiscal crisis could happen again, much the same way.
Well, it has to do with people borrowing more money than they can pay back. And now, the biggest borrower is the federal government. We owe too much money to foreigners, and we're getting close to the point where we're as in debt to foreigners, relative to the size of our wealth in the economy, as the Greeks, the Spaniards, or the Irish were when their economies failed. Now, with the federal government running $1 trillion deficits, we see that foreign creditors are starting to look a little askance at American bonds. When the Treasury securities went up in interest rates recently, foreign borrowers didn't rush in to scoff them up the way they have in the past. They're starting to assess that the U.S. Treasuries have more risk than before because Washington owes too much money.
I have literally heard people, including politicians, say we can always just print more money if we need it.
We can print money to cover our debts, but in doing so, we will inflate the economy. That really would cause inflation, very much like the Weimar Republic during the 1930s in Germany. And
what happened there now?
Well, we had hyperinflation. Prices flew out of control, like we had in Latin America, for example, in the 1980s and 90s. And once that happens, money has no value, and the economy can't function properly, and you have wholesale breakdown.
Does the tax cut impact this equation?
Absolutely. Essentially, the tax cut gave people back $150 billion a year. You can expect that additional economic growth will net you back $85 billion. tops. So you're still out $65 billion each year, adding that much more to the deficit. But on top of that, we had the congressional budget deal. The Republicans wanted to spend more money on defense, but the Democrats said, we won't vote this way unless you give us more money for entitlements. So we did. You know, as a consequence, the budget deficit continues growing. But that's where the real problem is that they can't control spending.
There was a time not long ago when maybe neither party did much about the debt and deficit, but at least the Republicans talked about it. I don't hear either party talking much about it at all. Do you?
Well, they do. The Republicans are deficit hawks when they're out of power, but they spend money pretty freely when they're in power. The Democrats talk about it a little bit, but never when they have the reins of power. The federal government is now spending about 2/3 of the revenue it takes in on entitlements of various kinds and interest payments. Within the next 5 to 10 years, that'll be 100%. That means the federal government will have to borrow money just to keep the lights on in the Capitol dome. We might not like going through Greek austerity, but the political parties not willing to be reasonable about entitlements and defense spending and so forth are taking us down the road to hell.
The last time America had a zero balance, no national debt, was under President Andrew Jackson in 1835. Next on Full Measure, major indictments of a story we reported about Backpage.com. Feds have shut down Backpage.com, the online advertising site long accused of facilitating sex trafficking. Last spring, we reported on how the company allegedly skirted the law to allow the sale of sex, even involving children. Now 7 top officials at the site have been indicted on criminal charges, including prostitution. Some have pleaded not guilty. Next week on Full Measure, U.S. Navy SEALs are among the toughest warriors in the world, but there's one alarming enemy striking them and other combat veterans that you might not have given much thought to.
We had come home from an overnight trip and found that he had taken his life in the basement of our home. Ryan was dressed in his SEAL Team 7 t-shirt. He had illuminated a shadow box that contained his ribbons, medals, and other insignia.
It's a brain injury that's claiming some of our bravest veterans on the next Full Measure. That's all for this week. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable. Thanks for watching.